Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia and welcome to another episode of our Theorycraft Thursdays. This is episode 3, and in today's episode we're going to talk about board clears. And board clear is pretty straightforward in most card game. It is where you use one card or a few card combo in a turn to wipe out the entire board, whether that is including your side or not. So, kicking things off, we'll be looking at the only legendary card we'll be talking about today, and that is the timeless card Pyrrhic Victory. So timeless cards are cards that are shared by all factions in the game and all time periods. The game of Elysium is a bit confusing in that you have generals from different eras, so they have access to cards from different eras, as well as cards exclusive to their own faction. For example, in the game right now, there is both the Trojan factions as well as the Three Kingdoms factions belonging in the Ancient Era. So you'll be able to use Ancient Era cards as well as Timeless cards. But if you are picking in between the generals, if you lock in, let's say, Cao Cao, you're locked into all the Three Kingdoms cards and you will not have access to any of the Trojan cards. But if you pick someone like Priam, which is recently added into the game, you won't have access to any of the Three Kingdoms cards, but you have access to all the Trojan card in addition to the Ancient cards and the Timeless card. So that's kind of how the system works. So having a timeless board clear is quite nice because then you can use it for any general of your choosing during any time period. And Pyrrhic Victory is pretty straightforward. It will cost you 6 supplies, it is an event card, and it will wipe out all units on the board. That's both sides, so your own units will be wiped out as well. And oftentimes it is when you're at a board disadvantage is when you'll be interested in looking for a board clear, or most of the time you'll just trade your advantageous board into the enemy. So whether you're playing an event-focused deck like the Dongzhuo deck I featured last week, or you are just simply behind because you're losing a ton of trade, Pyrrhic Victory will get you out of the pinch by wiping out the whole board and keeping things clean. Now, one thing to note is that it will only remove units. Your general and structures will still be on the field, so if the enemy is running a heavy structured deck, this card is actually not going to help you very much in most cases. So speaking of structure, one of the new cards that were introduced in the recent structure-focused meta is another timeless card called Demolition. And Demolition has recently received a nerf as well. In the latest patch in August, it was nerfed from 6 supplies to now costing 7 supplies because it was just a tad too strong with its synergy with all the strong structure cards that were introduced as well. And what Demolition does for you is that you can destroy any given friendly structure on your board and it will deal its supply cost damage to all enemies. So depending on how many supplies it costs you to play that card, it will deal that much damage to enemy regardless of its existing current health. So for a lot of the new cards like Citadel of Troy or Starfort that are 10 supplies, you'll be basically wiping out whatever type of board the enemy has, as well as dealing heavy damage to their structures and their general, since this card actually targets all enemies. So it's a little bit stronger than a typical board clear, so it kind of makes sense the cost is now 7. Now, one thing to note here is that you must have some structure in play for this card to have any effect. So even if you combo it in one turn, you can max out at about 3 damage, given that you have maximum of 10 supplies. Now, there are ways to increase your total supply at any given turn with supply caches or plan card logistic from Napoleon. But let's assume you have the max of 10, then you can max out the damage here for 1 turn out of 3 damage, which is still pretty impressive, doing 3 damage to everything on the enemy side of the board. So very strong card, also timeless. And then another timeless combo that has recently gotten nerfed is Regime Change plus Blot Out the Sun. So both of these cards are timeless cards, and Regime Change recently got its cost ticked up from 4 to 5, so that the combined cost of these two cards match more in line with Pyrrhic Victory, which does a very similar effect. So regime change will first reduce every single unit and structure on the board to having 1 health, and then blot out the sun will deal 1 damage to everything, thus cleaning the entire board and also dealing 1 damage to both generals. So this is a pretty suicidal attack, but it's a very efficient one if you're behind on the board, and since you can get rid of units and structures, in a sense this is even a bit better than Pyrrhic Victory, even though you are required to have both cards in your hand to pull this combo off. So this combo might be a bit too damaging to your own side of the board, and sometimes your general might not be able to take that 1 extra damage. So maybe we can modify this. And one way to modify this is to use some more faction unique cards or exclusive cards. For example, you can match up Regime Change with Drowned in Flames, and this would become a 3 Kingdoms exclusive combo, and you will just be reducing everyone's unit and structure health to 1, and then wiping out 1 line on the enemy side with Drowned in Flame, keeping all your units still alive, even though they will only be at 1 health. But even at 1 health, having units and structures is still a ton of value versus the enemy who's losing up to 6 units or structures with Drowned in Flames wiping out that entire line. And we can take this farther by comboing it with a medieval card, and this will be Volley of Arrows, which does 2 damage to any single target, as well as dealing splash damage to the units adjacent to it. So the maximum amount of things you can kill with Volley of Arrows is 3 units, so it's not technically a board clear or even a line clear, but it comes pretty close to that, as you'll rarely see enemies with full lines, and if you do, you are very behind. And even though this is a very costly combo, the Volley of Arrows have many other uses, as it does a ton of damage for its 4 cost. So potentially you can run this in the deck not only for this combo but for other uses as well. So it's quite flexible for medieval decks focused on dealing damage directly to your enemy with event cards. And moving on to Empire, you will have a lot more options, as Round Shot is a very easy thing to acquire, and with cards like Tactician, which will lower all your event cards by 1 cost, this combo becomes super cheap, and if you have accumulated quite a bit of Round Shot in your hand, you can regime change and knock out all the targets you like on the field at 0 cost, given that you have a Tactician on the field. So very strong combo for the Empire. And Empire can also rely on Grape Shot in case you do not have the combos to acquire a bunch of Round Shot. Grape Shot, very similar to Volley of Arrows, will do 1 damage to any given target and have splash damage on its neighbors. So at half the cost of Volley of Arrow, it does half the damage, but it is still enough to kill out 3 targets with the combo with Regime Change. So that kind of wraps up the combos for Regime Change, and if we move on, there are more combos that are not timeless. For example, here we have Blot Out the Sun plus No Quarter, which is an Ancient exclusive card, thus making this combo an Ancient exclusive combo. Basically what happens here is you will play Blot Out the Sun first, and everything on the board will become damaged. And once everything is damaged, you play No Quarters, and all damaged enemy units will die. So for 6 costs, or the same cost of Pyrrhic Victory, you'll be able to wipe out only the enemy units, and all your units will just simply take 1 damage. So it is pretty strong. It is very similar to pulling off a Regime Change plus a Drowned in Flame combo for the 3 Kingdom faction, or any of the other combos where you do not kill your own troops. Basically, you're selectively wiping out the enemy units. However, the weakness of this combo here is that it requires you to damage enemy units, and it does not kill off any structure. So why is it hard to damage enemy units when you have Blot Out the Sun? Well, sometimes you're faced up against a deck that runs a lot of shield unit, like Guthrum, and in that case, Blot Out the Sun would actually only take away the shield, and all the units would still be immune. So shields are actually very, very strong against most board clears. So if you're running Regime Change plus Blot Out the Sun, it would also not work because the shield will absorb the Blot Out the Sun, and you basically would knock them to 1 health and not be able to kill them. And with this combo, you'll just remove the shield and also not be able to kill them. So that's when Pyrrhic Victory actually comes in ahead, because you're just removing every single unit from the board, regardless they have a shield or not. So this is an ancient exclusive board clear, and we also run this in our Don't Draw deck that was featured last week. So I'll link that video below if you want to check out that deck. That features about 3 different board clears. Very, very cool event focused deck. And moving on, we have a medieval combo. So this technically doesn't guarantee you a board clear, but it is still very powerful. So for just 6 cost for Lone Survivor, you can pick 1 friendly unit to return back to your hand and then deal 3 damage to everything else. So 3 damage is pretty decent in the mid game when 6 cost cards are coming into play, and will almost essentially wipe out most key targets. Now of course there are tons of buildings that have more than 3 healths in terms of structure cards, and some mid-tier units would have high health as well, but overall you'll be doing a ton of damage, and this can also be a finisher given that the 3 damage is done to everything. Therefore you can kill off enemy generals with this 3 damage as well, so it's an overall very flexible card to include in your deck that needs maybe a bit of board clear or finishing power in the late game. And if you are playing over a period of 2 turns, you can also combo this with Regime Change, as it would allow you to knock everything to 1 health, and then you'll return your precious unit back, and then everything else will get wiped with this combo. Previously, when Regime Change only costed 4, you could actually 1 turn combo this, but because Regime Change has been up to 5 cost, this combo becomes much more difficult and requires you to have supply catch ready or some other method like Dawn's Raid to lower the cost of your cards. So by itself, pretty good. With other card combos over a period of turn, even better. And moving on, we have more medieval exclusive combos in that you can use what's called a Shield Wall plus Harsh Justice. And this is indeed very harsh justice, because the prerequisite for this combo is that you have a line of units. Now it doesn't have to be full of units. As long as we have some units on the line, you can give a shield to anything that's friendly on the line. So this includes structures, this includes generals. It's not just your unit, everyone will gain a free shield. And then you can deal damage to all enemies equal to the number of friendly shielded allies. So allies here also apply to your generals and structures. So with just these 2 cards, you can effectively deal up to 6 damage or even more if you had shields on your other line before you use Shield Wall. And you'll be able to kill off everything on the enemy side, not even just units. This targets structures and generals. And what's so brutal about this combo is that your side of the board is untouched. And not only is it untouched, everyone still has their shield wall. So that is actually super broken in my opinion. And this is actually one combo that I think needs a nerf. Because even though the prerequisite situation of having a bunch of unit on your side is technically difficult, it is not that difficult to use this 5 card combo in your second Daybreak after you have an upper hand going into it with some early unit build with your deck. And then suddenly you not only wipe out what they could potentially trade into your board, you also buffed everything on your side, essentially allowing them to deal 2 times the damage because the shield will absorb the first round of counterattacks. And then you are basically going to win the game with this combo. It only costs 5, super strong. The only saving grace of this combo is that it's only effective for medieval factions, and there's currently only 2 with Lagatha and Guthrum, and only Guthrum really runs shield decks. So that's the only place where you might see this. So it makes it less punishing because you don't see it as much, but when you see it, this is super punishing. And moving forward, Shield Wall is also super flexible with all the previous combo we mentioned, because you can imagine run Shield Wall into Regime Change into Blot Out the Sun only costs you 8, and your units are fine. They will still have 1 health. The Blot Out the Sun will only take away their shield, and everything on the enemy side is completely gone, so their generals alone facing your entire board, thus making Shield Wall very, very strong. You can combine this with Lone Survivor, which we talked about earlier. Similar situation, the shield absorbs the entirety of the 3 damage, because shield will absorb as much damage as possible for 1 time. thus leaving your side completely fine, and everything on the enemy side will get hit by 3. You can even protect your general this way, and you can lone survivor the one unit that's not in the line which you're giving the shield wall to. So very, very strong combos here. So moving on beyond the medieval factions, we can go to the Empire. And Empire doesn't have any technical board clears, but we have a few fun things we can do. So the most iconic card of AoE damage they can summon from the Empire is Sudden Barrage. It will deal 3 damage to all enemies in a line. And if you look at this is pretty good because it is direct damage. You'll target everything and you don't have to actually target a single entity. So you can actually kill things that have camouflage. So that's good. But the cost is actually pretty high if you consider that we just saw Lone Survivor, which is a little bit more flexible card. But it is punishing in that you will hurt your own side also for 6. But that card can also see some cool combos with other cards from its own time period, whereas Sudden Barrage is pretty straightforward. 3 damage to everything, nothing fancy about this card. But speaking of fancy, the Empire can get super fancy with board clear. So first we have Sloop, which is just magnificent ship that allows you to force an enemy unit to move on your turn whenever an ally moves on your turn. So anytime you make a unit move during your turn, a random enemy, could be generals, could be units, cannot be structures. Structures do not have legs, they do not move between the lanes, but you can force them to move. So why does move kill you? Well, Empire also has a card called Vigilant Watch, and Vigilant Watch will deal 2 damage to any enemy that moves, regardless of what turn they're on. So if you combo these two, given that you have some other units on the board, potentially you're playing Marie Antoinette deck, and you're spawning peasants all the time, so you have tons of token units on the board that you can move around, and each time you move a unit, you'll deal 2 damage to a random enemy. And you can force this a bit more if you have a few supplies, or perhaps you're playing this combo over the period of 2 turns with About Face, which will force all units and generals on both sides to move lines. So think about it. When you play About Face, everyone on the enemy side moves, so everyone will take 2 damage to start, and then everyone on your side moves, which will force the enemy to move X amount of time depending on how many units you have, and you have, let's say, the same amount. Then you'll do another 2 damage to them, and what's even better is that your units got moved with About Face, so they still have an action left, so they can move again. And you can deal another 2 damage to everything on the enemy side. So essentially, you can deal 6 damage with this combo right here to any general or unit on the other side, and it's not wasted damage because Sloop will move a random enemy. So if your damage kills off an enemy unit, then it will move something else like the general. So this combo is so deadly. And if you can play this over the period of few turns, where you have saved up a couple sloops or a couple vigilant watches, then this combo gets even more ridiculous. Every extra sloop is an extra move, similar to stacking open field. Or you can have open field active even, and when you play new units or new tokens, it will cause damage to the enemy. Or if you have double vigilant watch, you do 4 damage anytime a unit moves. So even though this is a super complicated combo, this is a super fun combo that you can pull off that would definitely help you win the game. And then at the end of our episode here, there are a few pseudo board clears that we can talk about. And that's the medieval card Shameful Display, which is something all Total War players are quite familiar with. And Shameful Display basically forces every single unit to go back to their player's hand. This is a pseudo board clear because technically you do clear the board. It only costs 5, and it's pretty efficient if you have an opponent that is playing control and have a huge hand, similar to if I'm playing my Don't Draw deck, where I would have a ton of empty supplies in my hand and I wouldn't be able to hold past 12 cards. Then every card you try to return to my hand would just get destroyed. So essentially you are board wiping. And then for your side, if you're playing someone like Guthrum, who once again likes to return things back to his hand because he focused heavily on Herald cards, which are cards with effect when you play them on the turn you play them. So you like to get units back so you can play them again. Shameful Display will help you out much more than the opponent, who are totally not going to expect it. So this is a alternate version of a board clear. And finally, Medieval has another fun card called Lay Down Arms. This card will reduce all attacks on units and structure in any given enemy line by 2. And can you believe it? This card used to cost 2, and it was the nightmares of anyone playing against the Medieval faction, because early on, if you try to gain control of the board, they slap this out at turn 2, and your entire line gets pretty much wiped, and it only hurts your attack and not your health, so you get a bunch of 0-2, 0-1 units that can't die and can't open up a slot for you to play other cards until your opponents want to kill them. So it is a very strong card, and even at 4 cost, I think this card is still super strong, because you are not only board clearing, you are making your opponent's board congested and unable to play things they want to play, while having them keep a bunch of useless units on the board. Now, it's not as straightforward as most board clears, and sometimes they can buff up the unit again. Let's say you're fighting against a Gathering Warband that will gain +3/+3 every time it moves lanes. Then this card's useless against that, but overall, still a very strong alternative to board clear. And that's pretty much where we stand in the game right now with these board clear combos. I think there are about 16 of them I mentioned here. And hopefully with the introduction of more factions and more cards, as well as more time periods in terms of faction generals, similar to how we got the Trojan generals, perhaps we'll see more unique combos moving forward. And board clear is always one of these mechanics that players hate when you play against them, but people love it when you pull off one yourself. So I hope you found this episode interesting, and hope you guys come back next week when we pick a new topic to discuss for Total War Elysium. Until then, bye!